Welcome to this week's Feel Good Friday. And this week we have the first in a new series of new recovery and healing stories. There's been a few comments about us recycling some old stories, people saying has no one recovered in the last 5 years. And the simple answer is I've just been so busy with the other parts of the vlog and other projects that we haven't had much bandwidth to record new stories, but we've got a bunch that are scheduled, and this is the first in that series. And this is with Simon Ratcliffe, and this actually came about because Simon emailed me to tell me about a podcast that he was launching and asking if we could help spread the word. And on this podcast, he's interviewing various people around overcoming adversity and making changes in their lives. Turns out Simon was a patient of Optimum Health Clinic, and one of the guests actually on his podcast was it's a very famous musical theatre singer, Michael Crawford. And so I said to Simon, the best way to promote your podcast is come and tell us your story. So this is Simon's story of his healing path from chronic fatigue and coming into how he came to interview Michael Crawford for his podcast, Turning the Tables. So welcome, Simon. Thank you very much for making the time to talk to me.
Pleasure. Great to be on.
So you originally reached out about the podcast that you've recently started. That was the initial inception of our conversation. And I responded by saying, best place to promote a podcast is come on mine, which is how we ended up here. So maybe towards the end, we'll talk a little bit about the podcast that you're doing and how that was kind of birthed out of the experience that you've had. But let's jump back to the beginning of your story with Turning the Tables and your story with fatigue. So to say a bit about your life before getting sick, and a little bit that you sent to me. You're working in advertising, and you sort of reference Mad Men, which I've seen a bit of the TV series. So it kind of left me with images of you kind of in New York in the 1970s, whatever it was, with fast cars and fast women and everything else. But I might have the wrong impression. So let's sort of start with life at that point.
Yeah, well, I think the advertising industry has something of a reputation, and I guess made most public by that series Mad Men, which I think quite a lot of people have seen. And it's sort of the archetypal Madison Avenue, New York, glamorous life of advertising, where everybody went for long lunches and did lots of inappropriate things. Unfortunately, by the time I got into advertising, which was in the late 70s, early 80s, it wasn't quite like that. So I missed the best bits.
Okay. Oh, well.
Having said that, if you compared it with any other sort of professional career, there were loads of very, very enjoyable aspects to it. I got to travel to the US about 5 or 6 times, shooting commercials, meeting people that frankly I wouldn't have met any other way, to be honest with you, and people who then went on to have careers in films and things like that. So, it was a fantastic time. And I got that pleasure because we worked on, the agency I worked at was working on the Lee Jeans account, which is a big American jeans business.
Yeah.
One of the competitors to Levi's at the time. So that was really where my career started. I joined an agency as a graduate trainee, and then carried on. I got lucky, I suppose, because I was the first graduate trainee they had ever recruited. So in many ways, I was treated somewhat with kid gloves. It was almost like, it was their baby. They had to make this work. So I progressed up through the agency pretty well and got to work on some high-profile accounts. I worked on the PG Tips account, which for those with a long memory will remember, the Chimps campaign and all of that. And I got the pleasure of going to Italy for several years to the shoots they did, which were interesting but bizarre at the same time.
So you were kind of living a pretty dynamic and exciting and busy life.
Yeah.
How did that then develop into something that was kind of unsustainable? And how did you know that that was happening?
Well, what happened is after about 20 years of that, I decided to set up a consultancy with a colleague of mine. And initially, we were able to do that in the context of the agency. It was a strategic brand consultancy. And eventually that did well, and we then moved on and we integrated with another agency and so on and so on. So about 10 to 15 years of doing that and working with, again, great clients like Coca-Cola, Kellogg's, you name it. It was very good. But obviously that was the pressure of building your own business. So no longer the corporate envelope to protect you, but actually going it alone. And then we managed to build that very successfully. And then we sold the company and did an earn out in a big American company. And I think probably 10 years in, it started to feel like this was getting hard work. Whereas you really enjoyed it in the beginning, it was starting to get harder. You had to focus more on the bottom line. You had a lot of staff, so therefore you had to get the income in to sustain the staff, and we all know that scenario. And so it kind of, I couldn't put my finger on it at the time, but I just felt that something wasn't quite right. It was like my life was controlled, if you like, by this business that I was in.
And what were some of that? What were some of those early signs in your body like? And how did that then progress?
Well, I remember that one day I was heading to the tube station, and I got into the tube station. I was rushing to work, as you normally do. Got on the escalators, heading down, looked at all these people coming up in the other direction with sort of rather blank grey faces, as you do in the morning. And suddenly a thought came into my mind. It was like, you're going to crash. Something's, you're pushing too hard. It's just, and as you do, the thought drifts past, you forget about it and you carry on. Then about 6 months later, the signs really started to although obviously I had no idea at the time this was chronic fatigue, but I got a virus like many people do, and that was sort of treated with antibiotics, thought it had gone away. Doctor said blood tests are fine, so, not feeling good. And I remember that we had a golf trip with a very important client planned. And my colleagues were saying, well, are you going to come? And come. And there was that, I don't know whether you know that feeling of feeling like you should do something, but not sure whether you should. It's like,
I think a lot of people watching this know that feeling. Yeah.
And so because I'd had the blood test, which said, oh, you look fine, it's just a virus or whatever. I thought, oh, bugger it, I'll just go and we'll see the sun, because we were going to Spain to do this. It'll be fine. Anyway, so I got over. That wasn't particularly a nice trip. I didn't feel great. I was standing on the first tee at the Valderrama golf course with my clients and colleagues. And it was like, even early in the morning, it was 9 o'clock, it was like 24, 25 degrees. And I looked down the fairway and I thought, I have no idea how I'm going to do this. Because I've got 18 holes ahead of me. I feel absolutely terrible. How am I going to do it? And somehow or other, that situation, again, it's very pressured. You think, well, God, I'm going to look such an idiot if I just say, well, sorry, I can't. So I just said, right, I'm going to do it. And somehow or other, I got through those 18 holes of golf. But at the end of it, we had to go to the clubhouse for something to eat. I was so drained. It was like, there couldn't have been more than 2% in the battery. I mean, it was really, really never felt like it before in my life. And we sort of ate something. I had a Spanish tortilla or something. And it was like I was hoping that as I was putting the food in the mouth, somehow or other there would be an energy transfer.
Yeah.
But nothing happened. And so that night, I just thought, I'm just going to have to apologise and say, look, I'm going to have to go home, because the next day there was another
it starts again the next day. Yeah.
Evening entertainment. I thought there was just no way. So I found a flight and got a flight home, and obviously went back to the doctor. And then the usual period of 6 months of sort of trying to work out what's going wrong, trying to work, but, doing it flexibly, going in some days for an odd hour or so, working at home and everything. Not really very sustainable. I was still feeling, I wasn't down at the 2% that I was, but I was still not anything like operating normally.
And that went on for sort of, say, 6 months or so?
Yeah, about 6 months, until eventually I got the diagnosis. As and people have said many times, almost like that's the beginning of the beginning of the worst bit, because there's all that uncertainty about what it is and how to recover, and you don't get much constructive advice other than, well, try a bit of this, and there's this thing called graded exercise therapy, which just none of it made sense to me. So I suppose at that point I was living what I would describe as a 50% life. I was able to sort of function in the sense of the home and commitments with kids and the family and the rest of it. But, it was no life really, because I felt terrible the whole time. And eventually we got to the point at work saying, well, look, you should just take time off and not try and keep going in and sort of see if you can recover. And initially, that seemed to work. It's got a little bit better. Started to think maybe we can move back and stuff. And then suddenly, well, not suddenly, then gradually it started to get worse again. But very gradually, it was sort of tapering down.
And what were your main symptoms, and what was your kind of capacity like at that point? What you could do or what you couldn't do?
Well, one thing I've kept throughout this whole period, which is very interesting as a sort of measurement factor, although it isn't really the ultimate one you do it, is I had a Fitbit, and I used to keep, and at that time I probably would say that I could do sort of 3,000 steps without getting completely blown out. But it was that sort of variability. So that's about a third of a highly fit person.
Yeah.
Like that. Yeah. And that was more or less right. But the point, the real thing about it was that I guess I hadn't really established how I was going to get better. And, I was exploring lots of things. Obviously, the Optimum Health Clinic was in that equation. But gradually, it just got worse. And then I had a sort of major collapse, I suppose the best way of describing it. About 12 months later, it was around Christmas, actually, where there was, Christmas time, there's a lot of expectation about friends and family and all the rest of it. And I felt that built up enormous pressure on me, apart as well as obviously the physical aspect of that. So I managed to get through Christmas, but then I just had an almighty dive. I felt worse than I'd ever felt. I felt like, we talk about the wiring, feeling wired. It literally felt like it was off the Richter scale. I was hugely anxious about the symptoms, which obviously, apart from the obvious one of the enormous fatigue, was also, the headaches, gut problems. It was just a whole ensemble of issues which hit me. And then on top of that, I got depression because, I guess not surprisingly, because you're in a situation where you're thinking, well, how am I ever going to get better? What's my life? I'm a burden to my family. All those things that people go through in their minds.
And how was the depression different to the fatigue? Like, what was the different felt sense of that?
Well, it was, it was full-blown depression in the sense of very bleak, like being in a black hole, really. I just at one point, in fact, I think this is the point when I think everybody around me realised this was not good. Was I just broke down and said, I can't keep carrying on with my life. That's it. I've got nothing left. Felt like I got nothing left. And my sister, who fortunately is in the sort of medical profession, said, "Look, I think you need to see someone." So I got to see a psychiatrist, and then we started a process of sort of trying to, get me back on an even keel. But it was rather ironic because, of course, the psychiatrist was up in London and I wasn't, and therefore had to travel there. And that was like, you felt miles worse by the time you'd done it.
Yeah. And what was the essence of the recommendations that were made by the psychiatrist?
Well, at one point it was, are you going to go into, the Priory will have to be the place. Are you going to go in and stay there and have proper, assistance the whole time? And something in me, although I sort of half of me thought, oh, thank God, because someone can look after me, as it were.
Yeah, someone else can take responsibility for the situation.
Exactly. Something in me said, I don't want to be here, because it felt like it was a place full of people with, addictions, the similar problems of depression, somehow or other just didn't feel right. So I didn't do that, but obviously I took, started on the medication that the psychiatrist recommended. And so I suppose for about 4 or 5 months, it was like I was plateauing. I mean, I wasn't getting better and I wasn't getting worse. And it was like, I was in no man's land, really. But after that period of time, I thought to myself, well, look, I've got to find out a way out of this. I can't just stay like this. It's just, and something in your brain turns on the light, which says you've got to find your way out of this. And I decided for me it had to be about understanding the condition, because that's the way my mind works,
Sure.
Training, I think that way. So so I set about trying to understand how this condition worked, almost doing my own research, although that was hampered by the fact I probably couldn't read for more than 5 minutes.
And that's often the challenge, right? The time in our life we need to be the most resourceful was actually the time we have the least resources.
Indeed. And I remember that from your book, you making, I think, a similar point. And so it was enormously difficult, but I just caught on to a few things. So one of the things I decided was that I would take up mindfulness, and I bought a meditation app. I know there are lots of them out there. This one particularly was Calm, as it happens. Mm-hmm. And it helped in some ways, because the only thing I could do, apart from lie in bed, was to listen to something that was not really, too taxing. And so I could just lie down and listen to it for hours on end as being the only thing to sustain me, really. By this point, going to the bathroom was about all I could manage. I was literally bedbound. And so this was a sort of, in a strange way, a sort of respite. But in there, I think it wasn't just the meditation. It was actually that in the app, it does actually start to teach you a little bit about mindfulness as a concept, thinking about life and how you live life and the rest of it. So there were some little grains, if you like, of sort of hope in there.
Yes.
And then obviously I started to work with the clinic.
How did you find the clinic?
Part of this, the floundering that someone has around, God, there must be something out here. And it was really that. So I'm sure I'll be typical of many of the people that who come through to you. I started to work with Leslie on the nutrition side, and then with Gemma on the therapy side. And so sort of start to have some grains of moving ahead, albeit very slowly. I think the other thing for me was I had to create a discipline, if you like, a structure. So not only did I have to understand what was going on, and for me, my version of it that worked for me was the dysfunction of the nervous system.
Right.
And how that then affects your other functions, and how a lot of the time we treat the symptoms, not the cause.
Yes.
And I could grasp hold of the sympathetic, parasympathetic nervous system and that concept, and it sort of started to make sense to me. So I spent as much time as I could on what we would call the brain training part, things like the stop process and other versions of that.
Yeah. And was that something that you sort of made sense and came naturally, and was kind of felt like it was a kind of easy path's the wrong word, but sort of like a smooth path? Or was it something that there were kind of challenges in the?
I think the tremendous challenges, it's so easy to think, what am I doing? This ridiculous process of going through, my thought patterns and trying to rewire them. This seems to be, rather odd. And I think you can just sort of think, oh, it's not worth it, And I think that's particularly true because as you get a little better, as you know, I mean, you've got lots of videos on this, you then take a downturn before you come up again. And then in that downturn, of course, it can really drive that doubt that what you're doing will work. And so for me, the one thing I did when I was having those feelings was I just put 2 stickers on my mirror. One said, stick to the process, and the other said, believe in recovery. And I just had those 2 thoughts. And every time I felt terrible, I just said, like, all you've got to do is stick to the process. However much your brain wants you not to do it because it's a bit more difficult than doing nothing and just lying there, do it.
Yes.
And so the components of that were the brain training, obviously being very, very sort of focused on the amount of activity, not that I could do much, but literally. So
you were really listening to your body as well.
Yeah, if you can, if this week you can do, and literally it was this little 500 steps. Okay, if in the next week, 2 weeks, you could get to 600, and then you've got those little sort of wins that emotionally sustain you. Having said all that, it's still bloody difficult, it wasn't easy, and it certainly was not a sort of smooth path because, I had the ups and downs, but, taking a macro view over the course of the next 18 months to 2 years, gradually, going that way, but moving in an upward direction.
Well, it sounds like your overall trajectory had gone from being a downwards trajectory to being a stabilized one to moving up, even though there were lots of bumps in going down on the bottom and on the way up sort of thing.
Yeah, and lots of doubts along the way. And I think, we all know this about people who are around you that also doubt and wonder what it is, and will you ever get better, and all those pressures that come, inevitably come with that.
What were some of the signs along the way that gave you confidence that what you were doing was working? Like, were there certain milestones where there's something that you hadn't been able to do and then you could do, or something that you were doing but you always felt crap doing it, suddenly you noticed you felt better? Like, what were some of the things that gave you confidence you were on the right path ultimately?
Well, one of the things I used to do before I got sick was I used to go fishing with some friends, a group of friends. And obviously I had no interaction with that at all. And this was like 18 months and it was really hard because it was a really important part of my, leisure life. And And somebody suggested, because we had a WhatsApp group, and what was interesting, funnily enough, is that they were brilliant, as support, because they kept posting pictures of how they were getting on. I felt, although I wasn't there, I felt part of it.
Yeah.
And I think, for anyone out there, if you can find those support groups, maybe in the most unlikely of places, nothing to do with chronic fatigue, but, some other area of your life,
But sometimes I think people can feel like watching that stuff reminds me of the life that they haven't got, and it can actually be a source of frustration.
Yes.
But it's interesting that, and maybe you felt that some of the time, but it's interesting you're saying that ultimately it reminded you the life you were kind of you were recovering for, in a sense.
Yes. Well, I think what actually the thing that I related to was actually more on the emotional level of, I'm still connected to these people despite the fact that I haven't seen them for 18 months, and somehow or other, the fact they included me and they kept including me, and people rung up and all the rest of it, you somehow or other felt less of that detachment, because I remember that detachment was one of the hardest things. It's like looking at life through a windscreen, if you see what I mean, like through a glass screen.
Yeah.
Which is all fogged up, even when you're in it, somehow or other, you're not in it, you're detached from it. You've got this feeling of detachment. And so I think that helps. Anyway, to go back to answer your question, one of the things somebody suggests, why don't you make some rigs? And I thought, actually, that's something I could do. And, if you're a fisherman, you make rigs, which is, the hooking arrangement for if you go fishing. And basically, they're actually quite complicated. And I thought, that's interesting. So I literally broke it down. I'd do no more than 5 minutes, and I'd start to make some of these rigs. And I managed to make a few, and I sent them to the guys, and just that was something I could do, just taking that little step further forward. The obvious things like, rather than 5 minutes reading, maybe I could do 10, or I do 5 minutes 4 times a day, or whatever the best way of doing it. And gradually, very slowly, I started to get better. More of the therapy input was starting to work, in a sense, and I think there is absolutely this snowball effect, which again, you've talked about in the clinic, and I think that's very true. And I suppose if I'm reflecting, for anybody listening to this, I think the greatest challenge is to stick with the process, is to not allow your brain to start telling you either this is not the right approach, or that somehow or other you're not going to get better, and it's just not going to work. I think the greatest thing you can do is stick to a process, even if it's not the optimum process. If you see a process which does more of the right things.
And it sounds like part of what helped you do that was the kind of sign you put up on the wall, and the kind of, it's almost like, I think, in our more positive and proactive times, we sort of have to plan for our more negative and kind of reactive times, in a sense. And so it's almost like you'd put things in place to remind the times that you most needed to remember, you'd put something in place to remind yourself.
Yes, I think that's absolutely true. And I think, for me, for example, then again, going back to your question, it was my birthday, and I managed to go out just for a couple of hours to have something to eat, came back, lie down, the rest of it. So that was something I hadn't been able to do. And gradually more things like that, until eventually one of my great friends said, right, do you think you're up to going fishing? And I said, well, I couldn't get up there. He said, all right, I'm going to come to your house. You're not going to have to drive. I'm going to take you up there. We'll just do a couple of hours, and then we'll rest. And then, so, and I managed to get through it. And that would probably, of all the things, was the greatest move forward.
Yes.
Because it really suddenly felt a connection with life again.
Yeah, it's like you'd reached a
Go
point
into
in
what could
recovery
be.
that suddenly life was something that was worth living, in a sense.
Yeah, and it, I've always had joy in doing it, and it's outdoors and it's in nature, and so all those things were very positive. And it really was a continuation of that again. But obviously there were periods when, as you well know, went down a bit. But I think I became much better at being very disciplined with myself, not to allow myself to be pushed into things that I didn't want to do.
And was that something that was difficult? I mean, it sounds like historically you'd been a bit of an achiever and helper that was kind of, whatever needed to be done just had to be done and sort of get on with it. And so it sounds like that, but it must have been quite challenging to learn to really put those boundaries in place.
Yeah, I mean, I tick that achiever box. It was like when you talk about the perfect storm. I mean, I could relate back to all of the things, really. I think achiever personality, trying to control everything, trying to, if other people are unhappy, saying, that made me feel uncomfortable, so trying to make it better, and, trying to solve every problem and be there for everybody and all that sort of stuff. And gradually, of course, I got an awareness of that.
What helped you put those boundaries in place? Apart from realizing the consequences of not doing it, was there anything that you could share that kind of helped you, or you think made that easier?
I think there's something which, if you go on YouTube, it's full of this sort of sentiment of actually believing it's okay to look after yourself and put your needs first.
Yeah.
People always say, well, that sounds like a selfish thing. Well, it isn't. It's doing the best for yourself that enables you to be better for everybody.
Yeah.
Better for you isn't compromising everything in your life for other people.
Yeah.
You don't get well doing that.
Yeah.
Because somewhere in the back of your mind, it's a not good enough thing.
Yeah.
And life doesn't need to be like that. And so I suppose just going back to where I started in terms of, things like the mindfulness and everything, that helped to get things in perspective as well. So there's some fundamental pillars of mindfulness, aren't there? There's of not resisting, accepting change, accepting the where you are. Some of those things, gratitude for your life. I think all those things are really important foundations to help you as you get better, to make sure you don't end up back, because as you say, loads of people get back to the life you had before. I didn't want to get back to the life I had before.
Yeah, because that's the life that made you sick in the first place.
I wanted a different one, and as much in the head as it is in any other way. I mean, I didn't have, obviously many aspects of a good life, but I think it's in terms of what's going on in your head that's so important.
And how have things evolved since that first fishing trip?
Well, I mean, gradually I was able to do that again, and I was able to do more when I was there, and I was able to do more things like go out and meet friends and, spend more time learning and researching things and doing things I enjoyed doing. And I suppose all the aspects of life you can just gradually do more of. Obviously walking was one of the key things I did from an exercise point of view.
Yes.
I remember the first day I thought, right, I've got to go out and walk, and all I'm going to do is walk down to the bottom of the road. And I remember it felt terrible, but it felt great just to be able to do that.
Yeah. And it sounds like you knew that you were ready to take that step.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're ready, but I think, another thing, that that you've said in all your material is that there is some discomfort in that. And the key thing is not to panic.
Yes.
Is to say, okay, that's understandable. You've done it. As long as you're very strict about how you increase things, you should be okay. It's not going to do you any harm. And that classic balance of pushing but not pushing too far,
Yes. Yeah.
Or sort of progressing. Pushing is the wrong word because that's the old word, but progressing.
Yeah, and it's a balance we get better at by screwing it up, basically. That's generally how it goes.
Yeah.
And so kind of moving the story on again a bit. So where did the idea, because you said to me before we started recording, the idea of the podcast, it wasn't that you decided to do a podcast and then you did a course. It actually was birthed out of a kind of path that you were already kind of choosing. But how did that path come out of this experience? Like, talk us through from, as your recovery was coming together and you're coming back into the world, how did that then kind of transition into this next chapter?
Well, I think the key thing on the journey, as I was able to do more, I'm more and more focused on the things that I enjoyed doing. I enjoyed learning about things. I enjoyed learning about a bit more about psychology and all those kind of things, which I'd used in my work career, but wanted to understand behavior, neuroscience, things like that. And the other key component for me was, it's rather ironic. I spent many years in advertising, which is fundamentally a creative business, as indeed the brand consultancy I worked in. However, as someone running the business or running some of the accounts that I worked on, actually the creative work is done by someone else. And so whilst you may be creative, you don't actually get any opportunity to do the craft skills. Yeah. And it was something I really enjoyed doing. So I determined I was going to do more creative things. So I taught myself to do editing, videos. I took up photography, which I loved doing. I did drawing, and I started doing writing, things like that. All things I'd never had time to do before, and all things I got a lot of enjoyment and satisfaction out of. And I suppose it was part of that, really. I mean, I came across this course. I thought podcasts, they seem to be really popular. That would be something good to get me back into, more productive and more focused activity. And yeah, so as I explained to you, it was the Seth Godin podcast fellowship course. And it was online, so, it was easy to do. And and sort of, I suppose when you get 3/4 of the way through the course and you're sort of starting to learn how to do things, it sort of seemed a bit odd not to carry on. So, and I'd always had this idea in my head about this. It was nothing more than an idea. It was called Turning the Tables, and it was basically this idea of you can get through adversity and come out the other side, and it can be better. And I guess I'd really realised that through the process, because if I thought back to the period of the darkest period, there was like no doors in the room. It was like black, and you couldn't see anything. And, I've reflected back to say, right, well, here you are now, And I thought, actually, I'd really like to get that idea out to people, to share that thought that, however terrible it is, there's a very good chance that you will get through that and it will be better. And so that was the idea. And so I thought, well, actually, this could work in the podcast, and sort of, with encouragement of other people on the course and everything, I then sort of gave it a go.
Yeah. And you sort of started off with this idea of, as you say, turning the tables and overcoming adversity and taking life challenges and using them for a positive. And then you had a rather high profile guest in Michael Crawford, who talked about his chronic fatigue experience. So say a little bit about how that came about.
Well, that was a amazingly fortuitous piece of serendipity, I suppose, in that while I was unwell, my sister, who's a speech therapist, was doing some work with Michael because he was back on the West End stage, having had some time off, although at this point I didn't know why. So she was working with him and said to him, "Oh, my brother's had what you had," because actually he had ME some years before, and obviously had recovered because he was back in the West End. And she said, "Well, would you mind speaking to him?" And he, he's a lovely man, and he said, "Oh, I don't know what I would say to him, but yeah." And so she gave me his phone number, not to call him because I wasn't going to call him, but to sort of just in case he did call her, know who it was, And about a month or so went past, and then my phone rang, and it was on the bed, and suddenly, oh, crikey, this is So I answered the phone. This was when things weren't very good, so I wasn't much of a conversation. But we did establish beginnings of a rapport. And he was very kind and just made some really nice, intuitive sort of suggestions. So that was really nice. And then he just kept calling me every 3-4 months just to see how I was doing. And
very sweet, very kind-natured thing to do. Yeah.
I mean, he is an amazing person. Basically this carried on till eventually, when I was better, I actually got to meet him, and I said, look, you've been fantastic. Would you do the podcast? And he said, yeah, I will. And so I think in a way it was therapy for both of us, really, because I mean he'd come through it. As he said, he was lucky enough to be able to go to New Zealand in the middle of nowhere and sort of just literally get away from everything. Went back to a basic life, doing very simple things like the garden and just simple things. And that was his route to recovery over a period of time. Obviously, as he points out, not everyone's got that fortunate situation. But
one can still learn from what that provided, which was a kind of simplification, a calming of the system, and listening to the body. And they're still principles that anyone can use.
Indeed, I think that's absolutely true. And to be honest with you, he didn't have any sort of intellectual understanding of the condition in the way that we have now, because obviously when he had it wasn't necessarily that thing. I think he said, I got rung up by the ME Association, said, can you come and tell your story? And he said, I can't, because I've just no idea about this thing. All I know is that he said, I don't know what I'd say to anybody. Which was very interesting. But I think that with him, he had an intuitive understanding of how you had to get better. And he sort of distilled things into very simple things that, like just go downstairs, have a biscuit, go back to bed. That's just little things like that. So, I think which I think had their component not just in the physical activity but also in the mental thing, and it did strike me that although obviously we know lots of people recover in different ways from this condition, and some people may well, their way through is perhaps through nutrition or yoga, whatever it is. Sort of my theory, going back to the point about the brain dysfunction and the nervous system, is that I think probably what happens is for those people, the belief in what they're doing actually switches the brain back and moves them out of this high anxiety, high stress thing, because they're doing something they can believe in. And obviously it does have some physical benefit. And again, you get into this cycle. And that for me helped to explain why people will recover from different things. And it's not necessarily the thing, it's what that thing does inside your head that's the difference.
Yeah, and I think it can be a combination. People can try lots of things and nothing works, then something has even a mild impact, and then that gives belief. They do more of it, they get more impact, that gives them more belief. And sometimes the thing someone sort of backs with their commitment is the thing that was the thing that showed enough progress. They were then able to say, right, this is sort of like, it sounds like for you with listening to Calm and kind of going into that mindful state, even if the symptoms weren't improving initially, perhaps it took the edge off something for you, which then was like, this is the first thing I can see that's done anything right. I need to now kind of commit my energy.
I think that's right. And I think the other thing was, in the end, I was doing all of the pieces of the jigsaw. So I was doing the nutrition thing, I was doing the brain training, I was doing the activity management, I was doing, the psychology thing. I was doing all of those things, and it feels to me like that the best chance of recovery is if you try and embrace all the things rather than thinking one of them is a silver bullet.
I think that's right. I'm mindful of time.
Yeah.
For people that want to listen to your podcast, what would be that we can include a link, but I guess they just put Turning the Tables podcast. That's what I did, and it came up.
I'll send you a link. It's Turning the Tables, Simon Ratcliffe, and it's on Apple Podcasts. There's a website which again I'll give you the link to, and it's on Spotify. And and I mean, I've interviewed, I think the point about it is I've interviewed a wide range of people, not just people who've had, chronic fatigue. So different situations, people with very difficult upbringings, people with issues with work, gender prejudice, a whole range of different things. But they all have this very positive spin of, they found a way through to something better for them at the end of it, really. Yeah. And there's a bit of advice in there as well for people.
Yeah, and I think what's great about that is different things do work for different people, but what's kind of universally true is there has to be, as you've talked about, a certain attitude that this is something that you can, to use the phrase, turn the tables on. This is something that can ultimately be changed. Yeah. Anything you want to say in conclusion, Simon? There's been lots of kind of lessons along the way, but if there's any kind of, perhaps what you would say to anyone watching this that feels like perhaps was in that bleak place you were, where there wasn't just chronic fatigue, there was also some depression that was there. It felt kind of hopeless. What would you say?
I think I'd say thank you to you guys, because I think the Optimum Health Clinic was an important part of the jigsaw recovery. I think the people you have are very high quality, very supportive, and I think that's a very important part of it. I suppose in terms of the things I've learned, I guess I would say that control is an illusion. Really just give up control, trying to control everything. I think there's an interesting thought process which I think is going on now a bit more, which is about, actually surrender to life a bit more. Life may present you with some things that you actually think are, very, very good for you. But if you're always trying to control every bit of your life, there's no chance for that to happen, because you've predetermined everything. Of course, we all do it out of a fear of what something might happen that we don't like. But I think that attitude to life of letting go of control is really, really, really important. Live the life you have, not the life you're dreaming about.
Yeah.
Live what you have in front of you. Be generous to people. Be grateful for the good things in your life, and have some fun. Yeah, and I really like what you said about, you could only do it for 5 minutes at a time, but preparing the kind of the fishing pieces for your friends and sending them, and that sort of still feeling connected to that world, despite the fact that it was only 5 minutes a day. I think those ways of staying connected, and that then I'm sure meant you were that much more connected, so your buddy was kind of knew what was going on. So let me come and pick you up, like doing what we can to still stay plugged in and take it that step by step. And I think it's amazing how it's turned around, and you, to be a bit cliche, but you turn the tables. I encourage people to check out your podcast, and thank you so much for making the time. I really appreciate it. Thank you. And one last thought I do think is important, and is that it's very easy to underestimate how difficult it is for the people around you.
Yeah.
And whilst it's easy, and I know I was guilty of this, of thinking, can't they see how terrible it is for me? I mean, why don't they understand, and the rest of it? I think if you put yourself in their shoes and you realise that they are faced with somebody they love, not able to do anything, that they don't understand the condition any more than a lot of other people do. And if you put yourself in those shoes, you start to understand how difficult it is for other people.
Yeah. Brilliant, Simon. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Alex.
Hope you enjoyed that interview. There's going to be more new recovery stories coming up on future Fridays. And on Monday, it's Mindful Monday. And there's going to be another guided meditation. So I look forward to talking with you then. Thanks for watching.